our session. So make sure to stop by the Central Mall, book sales and author signing tents after the session, book sales at the festival, help support the cost of the festival and the local literacy programs that we as a nonprofit fund. You can also help keep this festival free and open to everyone by becoming a friend of the festival or a sponsor of the festival. If you're interested, please stop by the Friends booth or visit our website, TucsonFestivalBooks.org. So as we begin, please silence your phones. Although that may not make a huge difference, given we have like some lovely music filtering in. But joining us today for the panel Ink in Emotion are Elizabeth McKenzie, Melissa Broder, and Stephen Rowley. So I'll read some brief bios and then we'll jump right in. So Melissa Broder, right here, is the author of the novels Death Valley, Milk Fed, and The Pisces, the essay collection So Sad Today, and 5 poetry collections, including Super Doom, Selected Poems, and Last Sext. She has written for New York Times, Elle.com, Vice, Vogue, Italia, and New York Magazine's The Cut. And her poems appear in Poetry, the Iowa Review, Guernica, Fence, and others. She's the winner of a Pushcart Prize for Poetry. She received her bachelor's degree from Tufts University. Am I too close? No. Okay. Tufts. We ended at Tufts. It didn't like Tufts.
Did you like Tufts?
It's alright. I was high. But she also has her MFA from the City College of New York. She lives in Los Angeles. Jokingly, this is the California panel. So Elizabeth McKenzie's latest book is The Dog of the North, a New York Times Editor's Choice, and, most recently, a finalist for the LA Times Book Prize for Fiction. Her previous novel, The Portable Bedouin, was longlisted for the National Book Award for Fiction in 2016. Her work has appeared in The New Yorker, The Atlantic, Tin House, Best American Non-Required Reading, and others. McKenzie is the managing editor of Catamaran and senior editor of the Chicago Quarterly Review. She's currently completing a translation of Giacomo Sartori's Anatomy of the Battle through a National Endowment of the Arts translation partnership with partner Michela Martini. She lives in Santa Cruz, and this is her 4th visit to the Tucson Festival of Books. Is that right? Yeah. So welcome, Elizabeth. Stephen Rowley is the New York Times best-selling author of 4 novels: Lily and the Octopus, a Washington Post notable book; The Editor, an NPR Best Book of the Year; The Gungle, one of my favorites, winner of the 22nd Thurber Prize for American Humor and Goodreads Choice Award finalist for Novel of the Year; and The Celebrants, a Today Show Read with Jenna book club pick. His fiction has been translated into 20 languages, and all of his books are in development for feature film or television adaptation. Can't wait. So originally from Portland, Maine, he's a graduate of Emerson College and currently resides in Palm Springs with his husband, the writer Byron Lane, who is also here at the festival with us. Maybe not here, but here at the festival.
Not here, he's sick of me.
And of course, there are 2 rescue dogs. So if you follow them on Instagram, you see a lot of beautiful puppy photos. So we will kick off the panel. I'm going to ask each of our authors to share a little bit about their books and kind of how grief intersects with their books. So I don't know what order you all like. We can go in line. We can go yeah, sure. All right.
Hi, thanks for coming. You never know. So my book, Death Valley, the inception for it was in the fall of, or in December of 2020. My dad was in a car accident that left him in the ICU for 6 months. He was on a feeding tube for that time and on a respirator. And it was during COVID. He was on the East Coast, I was on the West Coast, and so we weren't allowed in to see him for a few months. So, and my sister lives in Vegas, so I was driving back and forth through the desert to be with my sister. I was trying to escape a feeling. It was really anticipatory grief, and I didn't know at the time. I didn't have words for it. I just thought that my usual levels of like depression and anxiety, which are considerable, were like spawning new depression, anxiety babies. And so, and you can't escape feelings inside you. But I was trying, and I was driving through Baker, California, which is the home of the world's largest thermometer, when an idea came to me about what if there was a magic scenario where you could go inside and encounter and spend more time with your loved ones, so you get more time with them and encounter them at different stages of their lives. So I told like a writer friend about this, and she was like, right, you know, and I never know if I'm gonna be able to pull things off, because usually they start with an image. But my focus, so I started writing the book, and then I did another desert trip. I went up to Death Valley to do some recon, to do some desert foliage recon, and I decided to take a little walk to Zabriskie Point, which is a very touristy area where nobody gets lost. I got extremely lost, and I was like, how long have I been out here? It had been like 20 minutes, but but when I got back to my car and after about an hour total, and I finished and I started crying, I was like, okay, now I know what has to happen to my protagonist. She's gonna get lost in the desert. So Death Valley is really, it's a comedic novel of grief, and it's also a book about getting lost in the desert. And one could say that the desert has many parallels to grief. It's dry, it's arid. There's also a lot of rich, beautiful oases, and it's teeming with life. So that is how Death Valley was born. Yeah.
That sounds like a book I really want to read. There's similarities with my book. My book is The Dog of the North, and it's about an awkward woman named Petty, I don't know where that came from, who has a slight auditory processing disorder, and she's trying to move on after a series of failures with her work and failed marriage. And basically the whole book takes place in about 3 weeks, and it involves a series of misadventures she falls into with imposters. There's a detective, there are bodies, there are a pair of odd brothers who share a toupee. It's kind of about, I think the root of the book, even though when I started it, I didn't realize it, is in a certain amount of grief over my family's expatriation to Australia. And the character, this happened when I was in college. My whole family, including my sister, moved there. Making it, I mean, you can get there, but it's always a big deal to see them. And so, anyway, the book's filled with these different preoccupations, like step-parents versus biological parents, things I'm very interested in, awkward misunderstandings, self-delusion, and one of the things that happens in this book is that 5 years before it starts, Penny's parents were lost in the desert of Australia in the outback, and she's never quite come to grips with that. So in this book, she decides to face that with her 92-year-old grandfather, and they go over to sort of find out what really happened. So, yeah, and its namesake is, I don't know if any of you are familiar with the Charles Portis novel, The Dog of the South, but that's an important reference in the book. So, thanks.
The Celebrants was inspired by a couple things, and it's often the way for writers, like different inspirations overlap. I've driven by that large thermometer many times. I've never really stopped thinking I would get inspiration from that, but I'm going to revisit that. Early on when we were quarantining at home, and it still seemed like fun, like, oh, this would be like a 2-week vacation. And we were like, I was like, well, let's check out Netflix or whatever movies I can stream. And I wanted something that was familiar, but that I hadn't seen in a long time. And I stumbled across the movie The Big Chill. you'll have to remember for the soundtrack of like 60s R&B hits, Motown hits. But I'm watching this movie, and it is about a group of college friends who reunite after death. And you know, it's all about the stresses of middle age and what the back halves of their lives are going to look like. And I'm watching this movie, and all of the characters were 35. And as someone who was turning 50 that year, like, that did not settle well. So, but I was concerned about a group of college friends, because I do have a close group of college friends. And the other thing that happened, sadly, is that I lost one of my best friends to breast cancer. And this was like before COVID, but I was overseas. I was in Italy. Like, did you have a number for Vogue Italia? I feel qualified. But I was in Italy at the time that she passed, and I immediately wanted to cut short my trip and rush home. And all of our friends said, no, that's not what she would have wanted. Funerals are for the living. And what, of course, they meant by that was that funerals are a ritual that we have to comfort those who are left behind. But my writerly brain got stuck on that sort of literally. What if funerals were for the living? What if we, could gather everyone, have a celebration around a person who's still very much here, and tell them and say all the things about them and how they've affected our lives in positive ways, and how might that affect their life moving forward if they could hear all the things that we had to say about them while they can still benefit from them. So the Celebrants is about a group of college friends who make a pact at Berkeley right before graduation when they lose one of their own to suicide. And after his funeral, they think if only he had been here to hear all the things that were said about him, maybe he would have made a different choice. And so they make a pact to reunite as they're about to scatter all, to different parts of the earth, to reunite at a moment's notice, to throw each person their sort of living funeral, at a dark moment in their life, hoping that will help re-inspire them with a passion for them. And so they think it's like a little silly that they may never need this pact, but sure enough, over the decades, life starts to intervene, and a pact they made in youth helps them endure and thrive.
Different forms of grief. Oh my God, grief! I'm gonna yell at everything. But I love that they each did it with some sense of humor. So I guess I'm curious to know, how did you approach balancing kind of the weight of the serious moments with the humor? And like, did you ever feel like, am I making this funny and I shouldn't be? Or like, is this only my humor? Will other people get this? Like, how did you do that with each of your books?
Sure.
Sequence? Okay. So my first two novels were very sexy. And I promised my Aunt Etta that I would write a book that she's 81. I guess. And I would write a book that she could do at a book club.
So this book is not sexy. So whenever there's a little masturbation on the side of the mouth, but that's about it. And so when I write sex, I always I try to turn myself on first. Because if I can't turn myself on, I'm not turning on anyone else. Likewise, when I am sitting down to open my document, the violinist, Itzhak Perlman, used to practice violin 8 hours a day. I don't write out 8 hours a day. But someone said to him, isn't that hard? And he said, the hardest part is opening the violin case. And for me, the hardest part is opening the document. And I think that when I know that I'm going to be making myself laugh, when there's going to be humor involved, especially for dark themes, which all of my books tend to have, it's a lot easier to open the document. So I think it's really a very selfish pursuit. But I also, my friend the writer Susan Cheever always says you can tell when the author's having a good time writing a book. And while the process of writing a novel it's definitely not always a good time, because you sometimes find yourself at a ligament, a section that you're like,
I had no idea I was going to be writing this scene when I had this fantasy of this book. At the same time, like, I think it's important to have as good of a time as possible. Humor allows me to do that, especially in the darkness.
Yeah, same here. My books, especially the last two, have some dark themes. The last book, I remember showing the scenes to my writing group, and they didn't understand how these, they would come in every few months, and they didn't understand how these scenes of like wounded veterans and stuff like that, brain injuries and so forth, could exist side by side with some of the more absurd scenes. But I think finding a good tonal mix is like what I'm always after, and it's also humor for me is a personal coping mechanism. I mean, when I was growing up, or when I was in high school, I remember being really stressed out, and if I could tell my friends about something going on at home and make it sound as horrible as possible, and they would laugh, that was a good escape valve. And I like awkward misunderstandings. That's something to me that is often very funny, and it happens to me regularly in my life. Actually, I remember reading an interview with David Sedaris, and he was saying that after he based so much of his work on awkward misunderstandings, and he said that after he became famous, those started to happen less and less. And so he had to move to France because there he would start having these awkward moments again. So. Yeah, but nothing has stopped me from having those. And another thing I like to do with humor, and I think this is especially true with my last book, The Portable Peddler. I had a beef with the medical, with a doctor that had put my own father in a clinical trial that was not appropriate for him. So I wanted revenge, and I like to satirize things that are evil. And there's something Freud said about that. He said, humor is to be malicious with dignity. So, yeah. And last but not least, I also have a built-in defamiliarization mechanism. And basically, just very normal things seem strange to me. So, that feels a lot of the humor too.
I think it sounds like a lot of you know me from The Guncle, which hopefully is also a very funny book, but also about grief. And I do think it's like the most serious I take my work often is when writing humor, because it's finding that balance. And sometimes it's like a scalpel, like you go through like line by line, and sometimes like one joke too many in a scene can throw off the balance of what you're trying to do. But conversely, if you go too long when writing about grief without giving the reader the opportunity to like take a breath through a laugh or through laughter, like that can also color the work perhaps darker, than you intended. And for me, like humor has always been the way through. So it is, even though we're all writing about grief and grieving, I think there's some incredible room for laughter, and I think that's important because I think, I don't know if you feel this way, but we all write about grief. I write about grief because I think, as a country, as a Western society, we're particularly bad at grieving. And we've been through a dark time recently where there's been so much loss, and we may not all have lost a person, but we've certainly lost time, and the ability to be together in the same way. And, particularly, for a year where we weren't able to be together, what I missed was sort of laughing with friends. But I think, there's a lot of thought that grief is either like, we need to go away and sort of go through it, endure it on our own, or that we're a burden on other people if we're grieving. But, that's not the case, and it's not necessarily, depending on the loss, it's not necessarily a temporary thing. So it becomes very much part of the fabric of who we are. But I think it's so important to know that we're not going to lose humor through that there is, maybe it's dark humor, but maybe, that there will be the ability to laugh again, even when we're in the throes of grief. So I really try to focus on some humor, just because, even writing about grief, I think I just want to combine that with joy also.
So you actually just opened something up for me, and I'm going to go a little off script and ask a question that we hadn't planned. But hearing you speak about this, I'm curious, with each of you in your books, was there a particular other scene that you took the most joy in writing? That like either you cracked yourself up and you're like, this is it, this is the best, or just had the most fun doing, or element, or part, whatever it is. And Elizabeth, I keep thinking about like, do you know someone who shared like a toupee? Because like I'm like, where did that come from? But like, what are those things that
Like my
like,
brother on the side.
like when it came to you, you were like, yes, that is so weird and perfect.
Yeah, I don't know where that came from. I do not know anyone who shared it. They could, and I might not know. So a scene in my book there is a scene in my book that I had written before I actually got on track with the novel and had the voice. And it comes late in the book. I kept waiting for when is the moment going to be right for this. And it's when Penny is hiding in an airport bathroom because her deranged father has been chasing her through the airport to talk to her. And she has a recollection of the session she had with her childhood pediatrician, who would talk to her about her terror of being sent to visit this father. Parents were divorced, being sent to visit him in the summer. And she remembers her childhood physician is named Fountain Goose, which was fun to Dr. Fountain Goose. Anyway, I'm proud of that scene because she remembers what the conversation was like, and you can see that the doctor doesn't totally get the horror of what she's telling him, and is proposing all these sort of very simplistic solutions to her. And she doesn't even realize by what she's revealing. She's like 8 years old or something. But I had that scene to begin with, and I kept waiting for when is the moment going to be when she's going to remember that. And it finally came. So hiding in this airport now.
I'll say, like, for me, in this book, there's a sequence, there's a skydiving sequence. Has anyone here been skydiving? Like, does anybody here want to go skydiving? I recommend you go before reading this book, but no. I mean, this is a book about funerals, but there's not a high body count, so don't worry. But it was just a comedy of errors where like one thing was going wrong after the other, and I had the most joy sort of throwing my characters out of a plane, completely unprepared, and I was cackling away. But the interesting thing about writing humor in novel format, I think too, is like sometimes you come up with a really good joke, and because it takes a long time to write a book, you know, and then publishing is a long lead industry, you realize, oh, it could be 2 years, 3 years before someone reads this joke. And oh, by the way, I won't even be there to get the laugh, you know? And so that's endlessly frustrating. You know, so if you have designs on being, you know, a humorist, I recommend any other format. Mostly because I don't need the competition, but also, yeah.
So there were a lot where I had a good time, but I'll say, you know, all of the pent up annoyance, desperation, rage that I felt trying to get through the ICU staff on FaceTime to my father, who is not exactly like when you're on FaceTime with him, he thinks that you're actually in the room. So all of this sort of, but trying to get through the nurses when my dad was in the ICU. I wrote a scene in the book where she gets in touch. She finally, she's trying to get through to her dad on FaceTime. And the nurse has to hold it up for him. And she finally gets through, and she's in a restaurant. And the song
jump in because I think, you know, as I was picking up on what I was saying earlier, I think often grieving feels very solitary, right? Reading is another activity that can be solitary, and yet it can also feel very communal if you imagine all the other people reading the book at the same time, or if you're in a book club, or you know, you have an online presence and follow, you know, other readers and whatnot. So even though it's a solitary activity, reading, you can feel, and I wish that more people would feel this way, when sort of grieving can feel very isolated, but it should be like one of the most uniting human experiences, I think. And so in reading, when I'm reading a book, I love imagining all the other people who are maybe reading that book and laughing at this joke at the same time, and that I don't feel so alone. So I think, like, even though they're both solitary sort of endeavors, that imagining that we're not as alone as we think, I think is a good thing.
I mean, I think, you know, with a book, you have this one-on-one experience. You're in someone's head in a way that you're not with any other art form. And so it just helps give shape to your own feelings. It gives you words to express your own feelings in a way. You know, you read to see what you think. So there's that.
So my favorite book on grief is actually a nonfiction book called The Wild Edge of Sorrow by Frances Weller, and it's all about sort of the dearth of really like grieving rituals culturally, and you know, it's like you have 7 days, you know, and then like get back to it. And but I found that when I was reading a lot of I also really liked the Long Island Psychics book on grief. Good Grief by Teresa Caputo. I was shocked. I loved it. But when I was reading different grief novels, I was having trouble finding my own experience mirrored. Like, you know, one character was very angry, and I was like, maybe I don't have the self-esteem to be angry, or another character, they were like, this character really unravels after the death of her wife, and I was like, this is what unraveling looks like? Like, it was very neat, you know, and it was like, I've been more unraveled by urinary tract infection, and so, so I think that in writing Death Valley, I wanted to create something that sort of reflected, not reflected my own experience, but that would have provided me a consolation, you know. Yeah.
So the Long Island Psychic book you just mentioned, is that the same one that is referenced in?
Yes, so there's it's actually a New Jersey psychic in the book. Yes, so she's from New Jersey. Yes, but I was so deeply inspired by the Long Island Psychic that there is a New Jersey psychic. The protagonist is listening to an audio book. She calls the psychic Carmela because she's like, we got a Carmela Soprano vibe.
All right, I do have some specific questions for each of you. I might start with Elizabeth. So Elizabeth, you explore grief through the lens of like quirky familial relationships, and there's a lot of them, and they're hilarious. But can you sort of share a little bit how those family dynamics influenced how you thought about your story?
Well, I have a lot of material based on my own actual family, because everybody, when I was growing up, there were all these different cross currents of estrangement and people behaving in ways based on things that were invisible to me as a child, so I didn't understand why, you know, someone would storm out of the room, or, you know, be jealous that I was talking to my grandfather, or, you know, just different things like that. So everybody was perplexing and a mystery to me, and I think I've been trying to solve that mystery ever since. And I keep returning to that in all my books. Like, you know, I have some of the same characters in all my books, basically. There's always a very domineering and bizarre grandmother character. There's always a very difficult mother character. There's always an insane father figure. I mean, so yeah, that's a huge influence on me, and it'll haunt me for my whole life. And, you know, I mean, it's kind of like, I mean, not to say it's like Dickens, but I mean, he kept returning to those themes too, you know, a child, you know, difficult circumstances, and I think that's just that's my topic.
Thank you. So I'll move on to Stephen now. Something that jumped out at me was, you know, how your book, more so than most others, actually talks about sort of like the process of collective grieving, like how do people grieve together, right? And sort of, as you said earlier, grief cannot be lonely. So that was really interesting to me. How was that a challenge, trying to figure out how each different character would process kind of grief or reactions to their feelings, like kind of like figuring out, oh, how is each person going to respond to these situations and respond collectively to?
Yeah, I think that's, you know, first writing about friendship grief in itself, you know, that was something that was really interesting to me. You know, if you know, there's context for everything. If you lose a parent, you know, or something, you know, there's context for that. People can imagine that. But if you say you lose a friend, you know, that could mean a million different things. We have all kinds of friends for all kinds of reasons, and so, but sometimes losing a friend can be harder than losing a spouse. Even like, you know, there's some deeply close relationships with these people who've known you your whole lives from when you were, you know, young and had hopes and dreams and weren't sure what your life was going to turn out, and then are also your friend, you know, into adulthood. These are the people who can help reconcile those two different versions of yourself if life didn't turn out exactly the way you imagined. There's also no deal with friends. It's a natural order. We expect to lose our parents at some point. It's part of the natural order thing. Conversely, like if you lose a child, that's very out of the natural order of things. But with you know, and that's horrible if that ever happens. With friends, I realize, particularly at my age now, I'm like, I've got no deal with these people. They can check out anytime. Like, I really have no idea. And so, you know, that was interesting. But yeah, writing a novel about a group of people, and then yes, thinking about how each of them would grieve differently, but also that, you know, it's very much about this group of friends. So the friendship dynamic, you know, has its own life and beating heart in a way, and so how does losing one of them change the dynamic of the entire friendship? That was also something, you know, that was very much front of mind when I was trying to craft this.
Thank you. Yeah, and Melissa, I feel like what I appreciated so much, well, and about several of your books, was the focus on anticipatory grief, because I also feel like that's not something that's often hit on as much in the grief literature, where you know something bad is coming and you feel that preemptive sense of anxiety, sorrow, despair. We'll try. Every time I get too close, it screams at me. So we're talking about anticipatory grief. So was it sort of the experience you described when you first opened that really led you to want to focus on that in this book and sort of that anticipatory sense?
Yeah, I mean, you know, it's with anxiety, like I always have a sort of a feeling of doom that's usually unearned, so it was weird to have a reason, and I couldn't find a lot of literature on anticipatory grief, and the way that I found out about it was I was talking to a friend of mine whose mother had passed, and I was like, I don't feel like my dad has already passed, but he's still here. And she's like, oh, that's anticipatory grief. And she's in the book, she's Pickleball Sarah. So on Reddit. Reddit is like the Greek chorus of this book. I love Reddit. But so, yeah, I wanted to, I hadn't heard of it before, and I wanted to explore that because it is such a precious time. The time, you know, and I think like in a lot of ways, this book was like a way of preserving that precious time. But I also think that, you know, we can be grief avoidant, and if you're anticipatory grief avoidant, like you might miss that time. So I think I wanted to dive in, and in doing so, hopefully maybe invite readers to dive into their own experiences when they come up.
All right, we have a few more minutes before I'm going to open it up to audience Q&A. But I'm gonna ask some more just general questions because I know folks often just love hearing about you, your writing process. I guess if you could tell your younger writing self anything, what would it be? Like, what advice would you give to folks who are maybe starting out on their writing journey, or your younger self?
Like anything you write when you're high, even if the next day you manage to think that it's lucid, which is rare, it's not working.
Oh, maybe make more secret recordings of your family squabbling. I don't know. Maybe like the things that you think about yourself that are weird. Don't worry about it. It'll come in handy later.
Yeah, mine's going to be too earnest now. I don't know, but for me, it took me a long time. I was always jealous of someone who went to a prestigious writing program like Iowa or something and came out and published their first book at 25. That was very much not my journey, and I was in my 40s when I was published for the first time. And so, for many, many years, I was working and working and working and learning and failing and picking myself back up. But I was too embarrassed to call myself a writer because that's not how I made my living. And what I would want to go back and tell myself is like, don't, say you're a writer proudly. Just because it's not how you earn your living does not make you not a writer. I would always say, oh, I have this job doing this, but and I also kind of write a little bit of, and I was almost apologetic about it. But no, if you write, you're a writer. And I would tell myself to say that with confidence.
So do each of you have favorite authors that you enjoy reading? Why? What about them or their writing attracts you to their work?
How much of a reader? Is this being recorded? Strike that. Strike that. That's a joke. I'll jump in. I always get asked, writing humor, particularly like what books make me laugh, and I just read one that I think was so kind. I was laughing on the plane like an insane person. It was a book by Kylie Reed called "Come and Get It," which I think is really great.
I really like reading Kazuo Ishiguro's work because I love how he does self-deception, and that's a big thing for me too. Kazuo Ishiguro. A book that I read this past year that's blew me away is Same Bed, Different Dreams by Ed Park. It's a Pynchon-esque extravaganza. And another one I read just recently is Poor Dear by Clara Olszewski. It's just very eerie and bizarre and primal. So those were two good ones.
So I love Thomas Bernhard. He's my boy. He's dead, but he's like very funny in a suicidal way. And then I love Clarice Lispector, and I love Marguerite Duras. And I also, in general, on the Marguerite front, like I really love books of longing. So if you like books of longing, I made a list online. I don't know, do you all know Bookshop? It's like the indie consortium. So I made a list online. So if you just Google Broder books of longing, it's like a list of like 50 of awesome books of longing, many from small presses, but yeah, a full-blown list. If you like longing, you'll love this list.
I've also loved Joan Didion. I've read everything by Joan Didion, and I tried to get published. My first book was a book called Lily and the Octopus, about a man who wakes up one morning and imagines he sees a small octopus fixed to his dog's head. And I tried to find an agent for that book by pitching it as a cross between Joan Didion's Year of Magical Thinking and Moby Dick. That did not get me an agent. Wouldn't you? You would, right? But if you want to hear crickets on the other end of the phone line, call the New York publishing agents and pitch them that.
All right, well, I think we have some time left. I'd like to actually open it up to audience questions. So I don't know if any of you have questions you want to ask the panel. I saw a hand right up front. most enjoyed writing, do you find you have to edit those more, or does it really make a difference?
That everything like 200 times, whether I enjoyed writing it or not. Yeah, it's all got to be parsed and put through with a cold eye.
Same here. I mean, my favorite part is the revision process. So, I mean, I might have an idea that I jot down that's fun, but I mean, I'm constantly looking for ways to bring it out more and, polish it. So I many times rewrite stuff. Yeah.
We've all heard the phrase "kill your darlings," right? And that's never more true than when writing humor. I think like sometimes you get very enamored with a joke and you realize, oh, it just is slowing down the action, or it requires too much setup for the punchline or something. And so that's always, when I'm having fun, that's usually when that happens, when I layer in too much. And so yeah, it does take a little like bird's eye view of the sequence when you're done to realize what needs to come out. Sometimes that's very painful, and I can't hit delete. I put them all in another folder, but I don't really go back. They're there. Yeah.
All right, I see a hand up front here.
I just lost my best friend for 3 years suddenly. And it's totally about and it's my vacation books about my when I lost my mom. And like you said, that's like that happened. But I'm just wondering, other than 4 books, is there a book that you a fiction that you tell people that's both really smoothly about grief and walking in different ways with others? I'm starting to see, I don't know if it's because people now aware, but more people are willing to write about it, which I think is incredibly powerful for kind of like writing a story. I didn't know if there was another book you guys that maybe inspired action.
Yeah, so the question was, are there other books about grief that inspired our panelists?
I mean, for me, it was really those 2 nonfictions. It was The Wild Edge of Sorrow, which is beautiful, and it's all about creating ritual, both with community and rituals for yourself. And then, if you are interested in signs, which I got very woo-woo into after my dad died, and still get a little into, there's a book called Signs, but it's, from like a metaphoric perspective, there's ways to have connections, right, with the people we've lost that can even be very tangible and visual. So my recommendations are those 2 books.
A book I've read that I think is great on that is, I think it's called Traveling with Ghosts. I think that's the title, and it's by Shannon Leon Fowler. She's Karen Joy Fowler's daughter. And it's a memoir about how she was in Thailand with her fiance, and he was killed by a jellyfish. And he died like 30 seconds after they went into the water in her arms. And that's just the beginning of the book. Then it goes on to show how she tried to process that grief by traveling in war-torn areas of Eastern Europe, in the former Yugoslavia. And it's just a brilliant, beautiful book about grief and how somebody dealt with it.
Yeah, I always think of great big books, the sort of big novels, because not only are they, not necessarily just about grief, although something like A Little Life, might be, but, I think like that encompass the whole human experience. A book that's been a touchstone for me is Amazing Adventures of Cavalier and Clay, which is not necessarily touching on the loss of one thing, but the loss of identity, the loss of culture, the loss of, there's lots of things that can be grieving. But I love, when wanting to read about grief, I love sort of big, expansive novels that grief is part of, because it's such a part of life. But anyway, I'm very sorry for your own loss.